50 years ago, on Saturday, the 31st of January 1953, the people of Stranraer in Scotland and Larne and Donaghadee in Northern Ireland shared in the shock and grief of one of the worst disasters in British waters. It was the sinking of the Larne-Stranraer ferry, the Princess Victoria, in the North Channel outside Belfast Lough. The loss of life was estimated at 133, many of them women and children. Newspapers focused on little else for days.
Sunday Mail, 1st February. Irish boat disaster. 132 people perish. No women or children survive.
Belfast Telegraph, 31st of January. Larne steamer abandoned in gale. 180 Ulster-bound passengers
Irish
take
News,
to rafts
2nd
in
February.
seas.
128 die, 44 saved in worst Irish shipping disaster. Survivors tell
The Northern Whig, 2nd of February. Seas give up 63 dead.
Newsletter,
65
2nd of February. Heavy death toll and tragic weekend.
Galloway Advertiser and Wicketshire Free Press. Appalling tragedy in Channel. Stranraer stricken with grief. Princess Victoria lost with 128 lives. No officers, women or children saved.
It was an icy cold, stormy winter morning when the British Railways car ferry, the Princess Victoria, built on the Clyde and in operation for 6 years, left Stranraer on her routine crossing to Larne. Her captain was 55 years old, James Ferguson from Stranraer. She left dock 15 minutes late at 7:45. She was carrying 127 passengers. They included the Deputy Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Major J. Maynard Sinclair, and the MP for North Down, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Walter Smiles. Many women and children and staff from Short and Harland's plant at Wigg Bay, hoping to enjoy some time at home with their families as well. Her crew of 49 came from both sides of the channel. This time the crossing would be anything but routine. Much of Western Europe and Britain was being lashed by severe gales. The coastal waters forecast for the Saturday intimated south to southwest gales veering northwest later for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Why did she sail when conditions were so bad?
There's a tradition in the first part of the 20th century and going back into the last century of ships sailing no matter what. Nowadays we're quite used to turning on the news and hearing that the Seacat is off or the HSS is off. But in the days when the steamers carried the mail especially, and they were the main link between Ireland and England and Scotland, they simply went through everything. As far as I'm aware, it was pretty unusual to even put in to shelter. The ship might be late coming into Belfast and have a very bad night, but the tradition was that you went ahead. The ships were extremely staunch, and there was no history on the Irish Sea of disaster. So they would have a confidence in their ship which was probably, in retrospect, misplaced.
Historian Ian Wilson. As the Princess Victoria got out to sea, she encountered snow and sleet and a 60 miles an hour northwesterly, occasionally hurricane force and mountainous seas. Just a couple of miles beyond the mouth of the Rhine, she got into serious difficulties. She had been struggling against the wind for over an hour by this stage.
The ship left about 45 minutes late. This, I think, had been due to problems in loading cargo because of the very adverse weather conditions. She would have a fairly rough but uneventful crossing up to the mouth of the loch, and it was after she cleared the northern end of the loch that the problems obviously started, because she would then be exposed to the full force of the northwesterly gale. And either then or when he turned to head towards Ireland, it looks as if Captain Ferguson decided that conditions were too bad and that he would have to return to Loch Ryan. But when he did this, he exposed his stern to the northwesterly gale. And the stern, of course, had the vulnerable stern doors in it, which were quite inadequate to cope with the kind of seas running in the North Channel that day. The doors were stove in by the gale and by the seas, and the ship's card deck started to fill with water. And she rapidly began to list to the starboard side. It looks as if Captain Ferguson realised that if he continued on his course that he was following, the ship would very quickly fill with water and he would probably founder. So he probably then decided to turn round and try the very difficult manoeuvre of reversing back into Loch Ryan, into the comparative shelter there. But to steer the ship backwards, he needed the use of the bow rudder. And the bow rudder was normally kept in a locked position, and it had to be unlocked manually. So he seems to have sent a small group of the crew up to the bows to try to free the rudder. But this was a slightly difficult job, and at the time, of course, he was now facing into the gale, and the seas were breaking very heavily over the bows. The men were in imminent risk of being washed away, and so he seems to have realised that it was not going to be possible to free the rudder except by risking their lives. So he recalled them, and he then was in the quandary that he couldn't go bows first into Loch Ryan, he couldn't go stern first into Loch Ryan, and he then had to try to find some solution to his problem. And it seems as if he then decided to adopt his original course and try to follow it across towards the other side. And the thinking behind this was probably that with every mile he made across towards Ireland, he was coming more under the shelter of the land there, and that would lessen the ferocity of the northwesterly gale. It's also possibly the case that slightly or almost bows on to the storm was probably the best way to take the storm on his damaged vessel.
Jack Hunter, author of The Loss of the Princess Victoria. John McKnight was the ship's cook. He was 33 and had just married a Larne girl on the 14th of January, 3 weeks before the disaster. He recalls the conditions on board the Princess Victoria that morning.
It was a very bad day and gales and high seas, but we never had any feeling of not sailing, because it had never occurred before that we shouldn't sail or we didn't sail. We just went as normal. Everybody went to their jobs, and ship was loaded, and away we went, set sail. But as we went out the dock, of course, then we discovered it was waves were way mountains high, and when we turned into out the course of the lighthouse, then we hit the whole gale full force, and that's when the ship took the list and took it out of water. After leaving the harbour at Stranraer, cooking more or less finished, because it was a matter of lashing everything down and stowing everything away so that it wouldn't move, and seeing everything was tight and secure, which we had to do in gales at any time, but more so that day because it was a very, very rough day. And cooking more or less had finished, but we were all at our posts on the ship, and we remained there until such times as we had to move when they told us to go other places.
At 9:46, 2 hours after she left Stranraer, the Princess Victoria sent out her first distress signal in Morse code.
Hoved off mouth of Loch Ryan. Vessel not under command. Urgent assistance of tug required.
This was not a full-scale emergency signal, however it was upgraded to a full-scale SOS by 10:32.
Princess Victoria, 4 miles north west of Corswall. Car deck flooded. Heavy list to starboard. Require immediate assistance. Ship not under command.
Port Patrick Coast Guard, Malin Head in Ireland and Seaforth on Merseyside all tried to determine her position. The Royal Navy, Port Patrick lifeboat and a number of merchant ships went to her aid but couldn't locate her. Jack Hunter explains the dilemma.
Unfortunately, the authorities on shore did not realise that his engines were still working, and while he was very slowly and laboriously inching over towards the Irish side, it was assumed by the rescue operation that he had no engine power and was therefore being blown helplessly before the northwesterly gale down onto the Scottish, the Wigtonshire side, and so the rescue attempt was concentrated on the Wigtonshire side of the channel, when in fact he was heading for the Irish side of the channel. And this misunderstanding did not become obvious until comparatively late in the rescue operation.
At 1:08, a little over 5 hours after the Princess Victoria set sail from Stranraer, a radio officer, David Broadfoot, sent out the final series of Morse code messages.
We can see the lighthouse. Believe it's Copeland. On beam end. We're preparing to abandon ship.
The Princess Victoria was indeed lying off the Copeland Islands at the mouth of Belfast Lough.
I would say by 12 o'clock that day, I was in the top deck with the boatswain of the ship and a seaman, and they were elderly men, and of course they had more sense probably than I had, but they told me it was very, very serious, and the three of us discussing how serious we were. Sadly, they were both lost. The first thing that I heard was from the chief officer, Mr. Duckles. He told me it was, we were in very serious position, and it would be a matter of everybody sort of looking out for themselves. Of course, when it did capsize, then you had to look out for yourself. If it was a matter of doing that or you were drowned, we had to come up over the side of the ship, up over the rail, to get onto the side of the ship, which was heeling over, and run up the ship to get on its bottom. It was upside down. Now, one of these elderly gentlemen who was with me gave me a hand up first up over the rail, and I got back and got him up over the rail with me, and then I ran, as the ship capsized, I ran up the side and up onto her bottom. Looked round, but the elderly gentleman had gone. When I was on the ship's bottom, I noticed away quite a distance a ship's lifeboat in against the side of the ship, and that's when I raced and jumped straight into this lifeboat. I jumped on top of it, I knocked him out. It took him a few minutes to come round, but that's how I got to a lifeboat.
Quentin Nelson was only a child when the disaster occurred. His father, Frank, was one of the 7 brave crewmen on the Donaghadee lifeboat, the Sir Samuel Kelly, which went to the rescue around 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
When the lifeboat was eventually sent for, the Coast Guards directed them much further south and east, and actually the ship had come across the channel. And the crew actually felt that they were going to the wrong place, but they had to do as they were told, and again this upset them considerably, in that they felt if they'd got there just again a little bit sooner, they may have been able to do more, but nobody will ever know that for sure. It was a horrendous day. I mean, they were all seamen, had been fishing all their lives, and being caught at sea on a bad day is one thing, you have to live with it, but to actually set out physically and make the attempt to go on a day like that, it takes a special kind of person, and they went willingly, and it was absolutely horrendous. They left here around about 1 o'clock, but the actual action had been taking place from sort of mid-morning, and the lifeboats were the last boats to be sent for, unfortunately. And they were there until dark, searching, and they had picked up 32 or thereabouts people and had them on board. And they of course were quite distressed, and some of them in bad condition, so they had to come in, and there were no time in harbour after dark that they had to go out again to pick up some people who had been rescued by a bigger ship. So it went on right into the very, very late evening on the Saturday. The press arrived in droves, and the ambulances and all. The Imperial Hotel was more or less taken over for survivors, and the people were very good who owned it. And just everybody did what they could. This was a new lifeboat that they had just got, and she really hadn't proven herself, so I think there was a little bit of perhaps apprehension on the day that they went out. But it was reckoned to be like being in an open-top sports car on a roller coaster with somebody playing a fire hose in your face continuously, and wind speeds of 60, 70, 80 miles an hour continuously throughout the day, sleet and snow, an absolute blizzard. I think when they were down in the hollows between the waves, they got some shelter. But the boat was 50 foot, and the waves were between 50 and 60 feet, which is the height of the lighthouse on the pier. They only had very basic yellow oilskin coats, the old traditional lifeboat coats, and as soon as the wave hit you, it ran down your neck and you get soaked from the inside out. They actually found very little because of the wind strength and because of the waves. You could sail past something a few yards away and wouldn't see it. But when they came on the first ship, which had the lifeboat with 31 survivors on board, that gave them the elation. They had been fantastic at finding somebody. But then the realisation started to sink in that that's all there were. There were nobody else there, but they had to keep sailing.
Desmond Majesty was a young reporter with the Northern Whig in 1953. When news of the disaster was picked up from local radio reports, he rushed to Donaghadee, where he was to witness the aftermath of the tragedy.
I got down there to Donaghadee that awful day about 2:30, and the scene when I arrived there was something that you might have seen out of the old Victorian etchings or paintings of sea disasters. The seafront was filling up with emergency services and lots of people in cars who had been flocking there. They were obviously related to people who were on the ship, and as the news spread over Ulster, they came in all directions to concentrate on Donaghadee. And the scene was one of frantic activity. The Imperial Hotel had been more or less commandeered at that stage even to become the main reception centre for the survivors whenever they were brought ashore. Over at the old station, which was the UTA headquarters then, they had become a kind of information centre for people as well. And police had come in from the surrounding area to strengthen the small force in Donaghadee to control the traffic and help to run things and keep everything in order, because lots and lots of people were gathering. The townspeople were congregating too. The lifeboat had gone out, and of course the sea conditions were something that hadn't been seen in a generation, and they were all very much involved because their husbands or their brothers or their cousins and so on were actually gone out to see if they could find the distressed ship and rescue the people. It was getting on for about 6 o'clock when it became obvious that the lifeboat was on its way in with survivors. And all the emergency services then were completely organised. The lifeboat came in, and immediately ambulances were ready. Those that were injured were immediately rushed off to the Ards and Bangor hospitals. The others that were able to walk or assisted, they were assisted into vehicles of some kind and brought over to the Imperial Hotel. Some of them were able to talk, and they were given fresh clothing because their clothes were all soaked or covered with oil and various things. And those that were able to were taken away by their relatives.
More than 50 Stranraer families lost when in the disaster. The editor of the Glasgow Herald dispatched Bob Brown to the town to cover the story.
When we got into the town, we discovered she was down 6 miles off Donaghadee. The word had come over, and it was the enormity of it was immediately obvious. It was the same, but different from a pit disaster. The folk who had crew members on board were all gathered in the pier, and of course there was terrible anxiety and a deep sense of foreboding, because even in Loch Ryan, the seas were running what seemed tenements high. And as we had come down through Ayrshire and through Kennedy's Path, as the Firth opened out into the North Channel, the seas were pounding on the coast, and you knew that there was a big sea running, and the Portpatrick boat was out, but she went down off Donaghadee, and the survivors were landed there. So there was none of today's, I always regard today's mass emotional sympathy and grief as partly media-induced, because in those days, the Scots, like the Ulster people, were more reticent by nature. We didn't wear our hearts in our sleeves, and we didn't weep in the streets, and at no time did Stranraer weep in the streets, but that is not to minimise the sense. It's a small community, like all small communities that live by maybe one or two industries. When a ship went down out of Stranraer, the town, in a sense, went down with it. There was a deep sense of the enormity of the disaster, because it was really, I suppose, about the first post-war loss at sea that hit home. And of course it was also a dreadful weekend throughout the UK. Then the Victoria came on the Saturday, and by the Sunday the Victoria story was being wiped off the front pages, because the south and east coast floods were along, and enormous damage and some loss of life there. So that in a sense it was a one-day story. The Sunday papers had the best of it, and the Monday papers, it was beginning to recede. But yes, for the next few days the enormity of it came, and the poor partly lifeboat was out again, and they were still scouring for bodies and whatnot. So there was a great sense of loss, and then the stories began to emerge of a bit more piecing together of what happened, because unlike 2002, there was no instant radio or television coverage, and it was a slow piecing together. They brought up a replacement ship, the Maud, the Princess Maud, came up from Heysham. She had been in the Heysham-Belfast run normally, and she took over the Princess Vic's run on the Monday morning, and while she sailed in the dark, by the time breakfast time came, Loch Ryan was a blue sky, sunshine, and you couldn't really believe that 48 hours earlier there had been a terrible loss. Then the story developed as a story, the disaster appeal was launched, the Provost of Stranraer, a man called Cohey, and the stories began to trickle out about crew and whatnot. And there was a very strong Irish connection, apart from the fact that she was the short sea crossing from Larne to Stranraer. But Sharp Brothers, of course, had their satellite factory on the shores of Loch Ryan at Whig Bay. And the Irish lads, there was a big Irish complement, worked at Ulsterman, worked at Whig Bay. And they once a month had what was known as the long weekend. And as ill luck would have it, with the weekend that the Victoria went down, we went long weekend. So there was a higher complement of Irish of Ulstermen on board. So it was a much prized break, and I interviewed a fellow whose name offhand I can't now recall, who came down to get the 7 o'clock sailing, and as he said, she was bucketing about, tied to the railway pier, and he took one look and decided he wasn't going, and he lived to tell the tale and was not at all phased that he admitted, yes, I didn't want to go, and he was a lucky man.
The captain, 55-year-old James Ferguson, and his 9 officers and 29 crew members went down with the ship. June Kelly was a happy 14-year-old when her life was turned upside down. Her father, James Rankin, was a greaser in the engine room of the Princess Victoria.
I used to go down and see my father and take a friend down, which was a bit naughty, but my father, I mean, sometimes he used to make his tea with condensed milk, and he had a huge mug. And I've been down in the engine room many times, especially on a Sunday if he was on by himself, because the engineers wouldn't probably be working on Sundays, and he would be down. So I knew the engine room well, and the car deck. I can still smell it, actually. I can smell the oil. I remember the day well. I was wash my hair for Saturday night. We'd go to the cinema with my friend and I, and my father always left me money out, and I always got up in the morning. That was the first thing I checked. Very selfish. We always had a coal fire, so I was sort of sitting in front of the fire, sort of drying my hair, and we had Radio Airn on, which was a programme that we could pick up, because in those days you could plenty of nice music. And my mother was in the kitchen. I think she was baking, actually. All of a sudden the broadcast said, got to make this announcement that the Princess Victoria is in trouble. And I shouted at my mum right away, and then we went, my mother went down the harbour to see if she could find anything out, just put her coat on straight away and just walked down. And I still, you think, oh, it'll be all right, because you just never ever did dream that anything was going to happen. That's how you were. Even into the evening, because it was January, so it got dark quite early. Of course, there was no cinema that evening. And my friend, I still asked my mum, could I go down with my friend, because everybody seemed to be in the town, and the wind had gone down a bit. It was a dry night. It wasn't raining or anything, And I can remember going down the main street in those days, because that's the kind of town it was. It was quite, there was like cinemas and things going on, but it wasn't, you know. And I remember going down the town, and I still kept thinking my father was going to come in it, you know, by the rescue boat at Donaghadee or we'd hear word. I had no doubt that he was going to be safe. I mean, I never for a minute thought that anything was wrong, even at that point. But whether my mother did and she kept it from me, I don't know. I suppose at the back of your mind you knew that there was something serious, but because you don't want to think about it, you just keep thinking that he's going to be there, that he's going to show up. But then when they officially came and said, no, there's no hope, that would be about 4 o'clock in the Sunday, then you realise that he's not coming back. But seemingly my father was in the engine room from 6 a.m. to 2 that day. So the boat sailed, I think, about, was it 8 o'clock-ish? And he would be in the engine room. And they said that he'd hurt his head. That was just a rumour that we heard from one of the survivors that came up to visit my mother. But they were not specific, and nobody really wanted to talk about it, as I recall. So my mother never knew. And we just assumed that he'd hurt his head. He was unable to get into a rescue boat, and that he just went down with the ship.
June Kelly, whose father, James Rankin, was lost at sea. His body was never recovered. There was a young nurse on board, Rosemary Mullen, from the townland of Coolnasalla in Garva in County Antrim. She was coming home to see her parents. Her brother John still feels the loss.
She had went to nursing in April 1951, and she hadn't been home. She had passed some exams and earned her fortnight's holidays. So we understood she was coming at the end of January. But we never was expecting her to be coming maybe Larne or Stranraer. She must have missed a connection or something. She should have been coming to Belfast. We could never understand why she was on that route at all. So we didn't know anything or hear very much. We had been talking to a fella, Dickie from Ahidui, that had apparently seen her on the boat, and he wanted her to jump. And the end of the boat was sinking, and they were up at the high end, and he wanted her to jump, and she wouldn't do it, so she went down with the boat, and he was saved. We didn't hear very much about it, apart from that. Now that was all we heard. We never had been talking to anybody that had seen her apart from that one man. I remember that day. It was the worst day. I don't think there were a worse one since, because it was a gale and it was hailstones the whole day. And on Saturday night I had been sent into Garva for get a pair of shoes from a shoemaker that was getting repaired. I went on the bicycle, and when I was on, we hadn't even a wireless. When I went into this shop, there were several people on, and I heard them talking about this boat that had gone down, but the guy wasn't of much interest to me. I only overheard it, but I remember I bought early Saturday night. That was the paper that was on the go at that time, and I seen this was on it about this ship. But even at that, we still didn't think Rosemary had been on it, you know, for it wasn't in her. So then there were several people called later on that had heard that she was coming home to see if we knew anything about her, but we hadn't. So I think on that night, my brother brought to the hospital in Surrey, and they said that she had left home. Still, we still didn't know, but we went down to the main road to meet the bus on Sunday. There was a bus coming from Belfast about 11:30, but the bus went on, it didn't stop, so then we began to get worried. But on Sunday night, there was a cousin. He said he was driving a tire lorry, and he said he would be in Belfast early on Monday morning. He'd be leaving home about 5:30, and he said our body had been got. We had heard that there was bodies got and brought into Belfast, and if Rosemary's body was got, he would know her. So apparently he identified her there and then. So then my father and brother went up later on in the day, and they identified her. You know, we thought well lot about it at the time. It was as time went on, when you thought never been coming back.
Vera McDowell walked her sister Winnie and her fiancé Adam Hegarty down to the Princess Victoria that fateful morning. They were travelling to Larne to see Adam's family. She waved them goodbye and, like so many others, never saw them again. Her daughter Evelyn Bell tells what happened that morning.
Well, they were called Winnie and Adam, and I think Adam's family still live in Larne, but he worked on one of the boats, but he was in a dry dock. And he wasn't meant to be home that weekend, but he'd swap with somebody had asked him to swap weekends. So he came off the paddy in the morning, that was the train, and my mum and her sister went down to meet him, and my auntie Winnie went away with Adam in the boat, but my granny had pleaded with her not to go because the weather was wild, but she wouldn't listen, and they went away, and that was the last they were ever seen. They had another sister who was married, and this other sister's husband and my mother had to go to identify the body, but I think my auntie's body was the last body that they found. So by that time, my mother said she'd seen that many bodies that had been brought out of the water. She couldn't do it, so my uncle had to do it, and then he brought like a hanky or a bag or something out just so that my mother could say, well, that did belong to her. And then I think my mum did go and have a look, but I don't think it was very pleasant. By the time the story was told to me, my granny was quite an old woman, and she had quite a lot of grandchildren, but I believe I was her favourite. When she got really old and she started to sort of, lose control of her faculties, I suppose you would say, she started to call me Winnie. And I used to go to try and stop her. And my mother used to say, no, don't. If she thinks that, then just let her think it. She never got over it. I don't think she ever go over it. My auntie would have been, I'm not just sure what age, but it was her birthday in July, and that day, it was because my friend's birthday's the same day, and that's the first my mother's ever said, oh, this would have been Winnie's birthday. And, she said, I can still remember that day as if it was yesterday. She said, I can still remember walking down the pier with her, and I can still remember the coat she had on. I can still remember everything. I know there was no women or children survived, but somebody told my mother that the last time they saw Winnie and Adam, they were in the water and they had their arms and they had each other. But I don't know if that's just something to make her feel better or not, because I know that a lot of the people didn't drown. It was actually the corks and the life jackets that came up and broken their neck. So I don't know whether that was just a fantasy or not, or whether they did. I don't know.
Only 43 people were saved, 33 passengers and 10 crew. They were all men. Historian Ian Wilson again.
The survivors all seemed to be all youngish men, fit men. And the conclusion that I suppose we must draw from that is that only they had the capability of surviving those exceptional conditions. I mean, we're in the Irish Sea at the end of January, and you would have to be a person of considerable constitutional strength really to survive very long, I'm afraid. The element of depression that it caused in the community, because not only were they most of the crew from the communities in Larne and Stranraer, but as you know, Northern Ireland's it's like just a large village. You're only 2 or 3 people away from knowing somebody. You're only 2 or 3 mutual friends. And so a great many people, if they didn't know somebody, then they knew of somebody or somebody from their locality they'd heard of who had been affected by that. The fact that it was midwinter and the combination of the exceptionally bad weather, I think it cast a tremendous shadow over the community. I think it's because it's too close to home. We're all used going on ferries to Scotland or the Isle of Man or to France, perhaps, and it could be any of us.
I did see the lifeboat with the women and children in, and it capsized, went straight up in the air and capsized and tipped everybody in the sea. But of course, we couldn't get near them or go on with the seas just took them all away. As the seas were mountainous and continued to be even after we got away from the old hull of the Victoria and we're on our own there. We had to put out a sea anchor, which keeps you into the wind, and it was then when we got all this arranged, we were really quite safe there, but we were being washed, waves were coming over us all the time, but we were safe where we were in the lifeboat. Then the first we saw was the part of the Nochter, the oil tanker, which come in close to us, and they tried to take us alongside, but they put a ladder over the side, over the stern of the Nochter, and myself I tried to catch the ladder and jump. They hadn't attached the ladder on board their ship, so when I grabbed the ladder, it ran into the sea with us, and I was back in the sea. And luck again was with us. When I come up, I managed to grab a lifeline on the side of the lifeboat and locked my arm through that. The people on the oil tanker decided it was going to be too dangerous to attempt any more ways of getting aboard them, so they cut us loose and let us go. The people in the lifeboat thought I had gone. They couldn't see me, of course, but the people in the tanker could see me hanging onto the lifeboat, and they shouted a megaphone to get me out of the water. One of the seamen of the Victoria, who was in the lifeboat, reached over, and I managed to get a leg up, and he levered me in like a piece of wood back into the lifeboat. And that's how. But then I discovered I had lost tops of 2 fingers and injured legs. But during that period of time, probably another half hour's time, we saw the Donaghadee lifeboat, and then they shouted to us they were coming in for us, but they'd only take on 3 or 4 at a time, which they did, you know, and they managed to get the whole lot of us into the Donaghadee lifeboat. The experience in the Donaghadee lifeboat is again something which is, one minute you'd be sitting dry and the next minute you're sitting up to the waist in water. As lifeboats take on a lot of water, but it runs away again. One of the crew gave us a cigarette, but by the time I got it late, it was gone too. But from there on, we just started when they took us into Donaghadee, and the first thing they asked was, there any injured on board? And they said there was one, so that was me. And I was taken to Newtownards Hospital.
Myths and legends have grown up around the disaster. Was Captain Ferguson persuaded to sail because he had 2 eminent politicians on board?
All that can be said with certainty is that 2 prominent Northern Irish politicians were sailing on the boat that morning. The Stormont Deputy Prime Minister was on board, and the MP for, I think it was South Down, was on board. What is beyond doubt is that they were on the passenger list and they sailed with her. Whether they attempted to bring any influence to bear, I just don't know. I have no idea. You hear a story to that effect, but there are many stories that circulate about, the circumstances in which the Victoria sank, and none of them really has any sort of evidence behind them.
It has recently been disclosed that a British submarine picked up one of the distress calls from the Princess Victoria, but that its commander decided not to go to her rescue. Could more lives have been saved if he'd gone to the scene of the disaster? Writer Jack Hunter again.
The decision of the submarine captain to ignore the SOS signal and proceed on course to Canada, which was his destination, I think was perfectly understandable and reasonable in the circumstances, because a submarine is the worst possible craft to use in any kind of seaborne rescue operation, obviously. Furthermore, he knew from the SOS that the Victoria was only 4 miles off the Scottish coast. He knew that she was in an extremely busy shipping lane, because that's what the North Channel is. He knew there were lifeboat stations in the vicinity and aircraft also at Aldergrove on the Irish side. It seems to be quite reasonable to assume that much better equipped craft and facilities would be available to help the Victoria in quite short space of time. With hindsight, yes, it is possible to say if he had gone to her rescue, then yes, he could have done two vital things. He could have located the ship and found her position, because that was one of great problems of the rescue operation, was a confusion about her position. He could possibly have clarified that, and with his modern equipment, his radio equipment on board, he could have acted as a sort of communication centre, helping to coordinate the various messages. But that's easy enough to say with hindsight. That morning, remember it's 1953 in a comparatively advanced technological age, I don't think anyone could ever have imagined that the Victoria was effectively going to be lost in the North Channel and that there's going to be a major problem with communications. It was not a thing that any reasonable person would have anticipated.
The public inquiry, held some months after the disaster, pulled no punches about what had led to the sinking of the Princess Victoria and the loss of so many lives. She was deemed to have been unseaworthy because of the inadequate strength of her stern doors and the lack of sufficient scuppers on the car deck to clear accumulated water. These were serious design faults, and the Court of Inquiry also pointed out that the British Transport Commission, with overall responsibility for the British Railways ship, had failed to deal with serious incidents which had occurred in October 1949 and in November 1951, which had highlighted the ship's flaws. The tragedy of the 31st of January 1953 could have been averted had those shortcomings been rectified. However, on that fatal day, many other circumstances mitigated against the survival of the Princess Victoria.
The Victoria called for tugs, her first distress message, at 9:30. Now, up till the day before, there had been two tugs at Cairnryan Military Harbour, about 5 miles from where the Victoria landed in trouble. They had moved to Douglas the day before, less than 24 hours before. If they had not moved, they would have been in hand to assist. There was a seagoing tug off Whiting Bay in Arran, which picked up the SOS. But she had already embarked on a course to go to the assistance of a vessel in trouble off the Butt of Lewis. Now, if the Victoria's first message at 9:36 had been an SOS, instead of a lesser degree of urgency signal, a 3 signal, then the tug would probably have responded to it and might have been able to tow the Victoria into Loch Ryan. So theirs might have been. There was an air-sea rescue aircraft at Aldergrove, as I've mentioned, outside Belfast. Now, she was scrambled that morning to go to the assistance of this vessel off the Butt of Lewis. Now, if the assistance of aircraft had been requested for the Victoria operation earlier, then she would have gone to the Victoria scene and the whole story would have been different. So the Victoria tragedy is a tale of might-have-beens and if-onlys. It seems that morning as if the whole operation was star-crossed. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
One of the saddest experiences I had, whenever the list of the survivors came through and we were being given them for putting in the press, I was at the time not only doing it for my own paper, but with my colleague in the newsletter, we were covering it for the presses of the patient for national circulation. One of the saddest experiences I had were people coming up to me, relatives of people who'd been on the ship, and saying, have you got the name of so-and-so? Have you got the name of so-and-so? And mostly it was, I'm sorry, I have no idea of that name. And they were devastated. That was one of the worst aspects of my report, the tragedy, having to be in the position of telling people that their relative was not among the survivors.
I was kept on till about the Thursday because on, maybe it was the Wednesday, a short Sunderland flying boat flew out from Wigg and a seaplane from Belfast. They rendezvoused over the spot where the ship went down, and some of us were on board, and the minister of Shewan Parish Church in Stranraer dropped a wreath through the side door and conducted a brief service. And again, a calm sea, beautiful day. It was a sad weekend, a sad few days.
I think the extraordinary aspect is the fact that the lessons of the Victoria disaster were not applied. And if they had been applied, then the very high-profile roll-on, roll-off ferry tragedies of recent years, the Herald of Free Enterprise at Zeebrugge and the Estonia in the Baltic Sea, these could and should have been avoided, because two very vital lessons were learned, must have been learned from the Victoria disaster. The first was that any doors in either bows or stern on a roll-on, roll-off ferry must be strong enough to withstand exceptional seas. And the second lesson was that you must split the card deck with vertical bulkheads, because if you do that, you reduce the extent of the flooding, and so you delay the time that it takes for the ship to sink. You see, what's often forgotten about the Victoria, in all the attention focused onto the defective stern doors, what's often forgotten is that the Victoria stayed afloat for over 4 hours after her stern doors were breached by the sea. Now, a ship that can continue to take in water and can manage to stay afloat for 4 hours isn't a completely badly designed ship. But the reason she stayed afloat was that the flooded area was confined originally by a bulkhead between the car deck and the accommodation forward of that. And it was only when the water started to seep through the bulkhead that the process by which the ship sank was accelerated. And that lesson was there, the need for vertical bulkheads, which is now in theory accepted for roll-on, roll-off ferries. That lesson was there in 1953. If it had been applied, then the Victoria could have been the first and possibly the last major roll-on, roll-off ferry disaster.
Half a century later, the pain and heartbreak which followed the loss of the Princess Victoria are still felt in the little towns of Stranraer, Larne and Donaghadee. Memories, in many cases handed down the generations, are still strong, and tears still flow for the men, for the women and children who lost their lives on that cold and terrible day.
The Princess Victoria was an independent production for Media Workshop Northern Ireland. The presenter was Richard Young, editor Gerard Edgeworth, and the producer was Margaret Cunningham.